Welcome to the Co-Authoring Chronicles podcast, 2 voices, 1 tale.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Helen Corvis, and I'm here with my co-author.
Hello, it's Steaphan. Good talking to y'all again.
Hi, Steaphan. How are you?
I'm pretty good. We're gonna get to talk about our story today, so that's always a good time.
Oh, man. I was hoping you'd dish on some of your personal life, but no,
Uh,
cancel that.
it's all about story. That's my personal life.
It's all
No.
about stories. Very good. Well, as you mentioned, today we're talking about the shape of stories. I think as authors, we're probably familiar with various methods or strategies or the number lists, right? Like the 3 kinds of plot or the 7 types of story arc or what have you. Anyway, this one's from Vonnegut, and he's one of my favorite authors. I have read a lot of Vonnegut growing up, and I think which is pretty common for some of us. And he had his initial rejected master's thesis was about the shape of stories. And what he meant by the shape of a story is that he would plot the emotional arc of starting at the beginning where the reader starts reading all the way up until the end of the story, and the x-axis, again, would just imagine a chart, right? An x and a y-axis. The x-axis is the story as it begins when the reader engages, and it continues out until the end. And then the y-axis, which graphs the up and down, shows the nature of events in the story, where good fortune is at the top of the axis and bad fortune is at the bottom of the axis. So just to really illustrate this, he would here's an example. And one of the examples is that we all know pretty well is called Boy Meets Girl, right? Boy Meets Girl. Do you remember Boy Meets Girl,
I
Stefan?
I definitely do.
How would you describe Boy Meets Girl, just as a general story?
Or you could say person meets person, right? But
Ooh, yeah, person meets person in a relationship kind of way. Yes. How would what are there's like some basic steps in this one. What would you describe them as?
I mean, it's usually an expression of a missing part in the character's life, sadness, a hole, whatever you want to call it, and then usually a circumstance that is not quite normal. Whenever I say normal, typical. So because we're reading stories for fun, we want them to be a little bit exciting. So usually there's a meeting that is in the stars or something, and then there's the negotiation period. And then you can have the subgenres, maybe um, the love interest or person interest is against or doesn't like the the person initially, and so you have all the subplots. But in the end, um, it usually works out, and there's love, and whether they live happily ever after or not. That's, I guess, later on in Vonnegut's Shape of Story, right?
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a really good way to illustrate kind of the nuance of the shape of a story. It isn't always as simple as a clean curve of boy meets girl, boy loses girl, and then boy regains girl, or person meets person, person loses person, person
Mhm.
regains person. But if I were to describe the overall shape, just as you basically look at it, the main character is at some point, as you say, they may be expressing a gap or whatever it is. They're going on with their normal life, but then, good fortune shines on them. They meet another person with the potential to complete them and make them whole. It's very exciting, and the shape of the story goes up and up, to some point of potential. Then something happens, as you say, the subplot engages a genre, enemies to friends, who knows what,
Mhm.
and the fortune of our main character starts heading steeply down. And in fact, it goes down and it drops below average. In fact, they feel worse now than they did before they met the other person. So we've got an up and then there's a down and then there's some struggle, right? And then hopefully they make it out and then they're happy again. and it goes right back up, maybe even higher than it was when they first started out the story. So
Yeah, that's perfect.
yeah, that's an example of the shape of a story. But as you mentioned, right, things can happen in those dips. So it's not always a clean line. There can be some wobbles, but on average, that's how the shape would work.
Well, we had that in our co-authored story together, In the Arms of the Void. Do we want to talk about that now, or did you want to?
Oh, I think it's a good lead in about why you want to do this because we should definitely talk about those. Yeah, actually, let's hear the example.
Well, okay. So, boy meets girl, or person meets person. I really like in our story, the Viper Glittrix relationship evolves from this professional distance. You know, Viper's trying to be the leader that's strong and doesn't show his emotions, and even though he is totally into Glittrix, so throughout the conflict, they keep this kind of professional relationship, and probably deliberately trying to avoid intimacy because that's going to ruin the professional distance. So when you walk through that, you know, there's this initial tension because of both of them wanting to be professional, especially Viper. And then throughout the story, there's a, you know, undertone of betrayal where Glittrick feels betrayed, and actually Viper even feels betrayed due to some of the secrets that he had shared with her in his life. Um, but they reconcile, and then later on, there's the final, you know, where they're definitely a thing at the end of the story. So to tie all this together, I guess this quote represents the situation where Glittrick says, "You belong to me, and I belong to you," and this was towards, you know, the very end of the story.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think the other interesting thing that this points out is when they were talking about how to use it, I think Vonnegut himself said that he liked to map the shape of the story through the main character. And then sometimes, at least I think Vonnegut said this, he would also map out the same shape of the story, but from a secondary character's perspective. Because I think you called out it's also a person meets person arc for Glittrix as well. But the thing is, they're not quite if you put both of their shapes on a graph, they're not quite in sync, right? They both hit different points at the during the timeline, though they're overall following the same journey. So it can be a pretty interesting tool for writing.
Great. Well, what other tools do we have here?
So other shapes that are pretty popular. This is one that actually really helped me in my life. I didn't realize this was a real shape, but it's called "Which Way Is Up?" And because I know when I first heard about the shape of stories, I thought, well, isn't everything just kind of an up and a down and up and a down? Not true. There's one called Which Way Is Up? And in Which Way Is Up, it's almost like a jaggedy little straightish line from start to end. And this is actually the shape of sometimes a lot of contemporary literature where things just happen to a person. You're not actually sure if it's a good thing or a bad things. It can be kind of quirky. And in the end, it winds up being kind of this slice of life for them that just, you know, it's the tale of their life. And that what I found hilarious about that is like this to me explains the plot line of like so many movies now where I've watched them and I've kind of been like, huh. You know?
Yeah, I was just watching, Night Sky on Netflix with some family members, and we watched the whole season, and my comment, it was, I guess, never a novel, it was written for Netflix, but you watch the whole episode after episode, and even towards the last quarter of the season, you're not sure what's good and what's bad in the story still. By 3 quarters in, and some would say, "Well, that makes for a non-fulfilling, you know, viewing or presentation of the story to not know what's good and what's bad, who's good and who's bad
Mhm,
until like the very end of this, you know, a book or a
mhm,
story or an episode or a season." And I kind of agree. And this is kind of interesting you say this because you're basically saying that, you know, which way is up? kind of describes that, right? You're going along with the story. There are interesting tidbits, but you don't really know. Is but is it successful though? You mentioned literary.
So I've never, I didn't actually think through a kind of a movie example for Which Way Is Up, but here's the funny thing: I actually don't read books that follow this plot
Yeah,
line or this arc. I've seen plenty of movies and like media that follows this plot line, and when we talk about is it enjoyable, I do actually find it's a nice for me a nice change. Like, not everything needs to be, like Age of Transformer, Michael Bay, you know, the Autobots arrive and then they fix like some kind of, problem. And in the end, it's a happy ending, right? Sometimes it's nice to see like character development, people, life happening. I don't know. I like it every once in a while, but the sad part is I don't read it.
yeah,
So
I'm with you there. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. The the interesting thing about Shape of Stories is, aside from being a writing tool, is that as we've kind of hinted at by this discussion, like we tend, much like a genre or or trope, there's certain shapes of stories that each of us may prefer more than a different type of shape of story. And there was recently a study that actually used the fiction collection from Project Gutenberg, which I believe is open access, and they pulled a subset of content from there and ran it through and used AI to try to analyze what shapes that these stories followed. And not only did they find that Vonnegut's shape of stories does appear to be like there are some very clearly well defined, like six basic shapes that most stories fall into, but they were also able to show what the most downloaded shapes of story are, which I actually found fascinating. But then when I read the results, I was like, really? Are these the most popular? And I'm wondering if it's maybe if Project Gutenberg's collection is based on more classic tales, or maybe my experience is limited, but instead of continuing to talk about it, I'll tell you the three shapes that Project Gutenberg identified as the most popular. And the first one they called Icarus, which is basically a rise and then a fall, right? Somebody does well and then they wind up not doing well. And at first I was like, this sounds very disappointing. I like happy endings. But the truth is, right, there's definitely this actually goes along with the second popular story type, which they called Oedipus. I'm not going to go into the story of Oedipus Rex, but basically it's a fall, a rise, and then a fall. And I realized this is the plot line of Gladiator. Did you watch Gladiator? And people love that movie so much. There's
mhm,
Gladiator too.
yeah, yeah,
Right. Yeah, exactly, right? The guy used to be a fairly popular general, but now he's been imprisoned as a gladiator. So it actually starts with him in the fall
mhm,
of his fortunes. And then there's the rise where he comes to gain the attentions of um the crowd for one thing, right? And then it looks like things are going well. His former allies may still be in play. He may be able to overthrow the evil emperor or something, right? But then in the end, I believe he gets betrayed, and it's a fall again. Did I remember that right?
I'm not the best source for that,
Or
so
probably
sounds generally right, though.
something like that. But it's
Yeah,
definitely also the plot line of Braveheart.
and probably tens of thousands of other stories.
Mhm. Yeah, and people love it, right?
Mhm,
The rise of the character is so amazing and you buy in. There's Braveheart, out there, and he died at the end, I remember. And for that, the only, kind of but the idea of what he represented, even though in the fall was pretty dramatically terrible looking, it was
mm,
still enough to people love the movie. So anyway, so those are actually two of the three most popular shapes. They end
mhm.
in a fall, which I guess as people we need that somehow. I don't know.
Does that relate to you from bad to worse?
It is. It's definitely the from bad to worse component of any story. And I think I remember us discussing is the nice thing about romance is we want happy endings. So I might have blinders on due to romance, but do we have an example of bad to worse
Yeah.
in our
Yeah.
story?
Really. So, yeah, in our story, it basically escalates through increasing levels of danger throughout the story. We start with a little bit when we let the reader know that, Viper's getting his people into a group of questionable company. And then they have their initial mission fails. And then there's the physical threat of outer space against them. And so it does go through that progression of bad to worse. So they discover the influence that the Tenebrae have on them. When I say influence, a little bit of a spoiler, but you could think of it like demon possession or even a
Dun,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, siren like influence on them.
Mhm.
And the crew gets infected, and then their ship gets damaged, and then they're about to get sucked into a black hole. So,
Yeah.
it does get bad, and then they realize that there's no way they're getting out of the black hole. Well,
Yeah. That's
so
definitely I can't imagine worse worse than that. Um, but I suppose if people will have to see. Yeah, totally agree. It's a very clear escalation of bad, bad, bad. Oh man, we're all going to die.
right, right,
Yeah. And
and
it is
then
thrilling, isn't it?
it is, yep, definitely is. So I think the last one is an example that we have as well.
The last type of most popular story shape that gets downloaded is actually called Man in the Hole. And in that one, they identified it as successive man in the hole, which basically means that as the story continues, it's kind of a persistent main character gets into trouble, works their way out, gets into more trouble, works their way out. So it's kind of a bit of a bobbly line, but it's one that we really like. And their popular identification was actually the whole arc of Harry Potter um, being the great example of successive man in the holes. The problems keep arising and they keep working their way through it. But the other thing I liked about Man in the Hole being popular is that overall, I think as you kind of identified, Man in the Hole is actually the arc of our entire story when you take a step back and look at it.
Yes, it is because Viper's had even his history, he was in the hole a little bit when his past history that we cover with losing the love of his life. And then his crew, um, they start out in this stable, everything's normal as normal can be for them. And then increasingly more dire circumstances happen. Viper has a failed mission. He's betrayed, he gets injured. He's got basically, mind control on him, through the previously mentioned siren type
Yeah.
relationship.
The bad to worse, right? It's the bad
Yeah,
to worse component, which is kind of like the micro shape of this part
yeah.
of the whole. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so we said, like, from bad to worse was, like, the secondary arc, but the man in the hole is the primary.
Mhm.
And then so, from Viper's initial failed mission in the very first chapter, all the way through having, battling the evil in the story, and then having the final triumph against the evil, and also, person gets the person, the boy gets the girl. So that's how it played out in the arms of the void.
Yeah, I love it. So that's it. Actually, that's kind of a mini dip of the toe into Vonnegut's shape of stories. Like I said, I think it's kind of interesting to consider the emotional story arc. I remember you once saying like things should keep happening, right? And I think it's
Mhm.
famous writing advice. Everything you write should have a purpose. There should be an intention behind it. And in one way, I like to think sometimes when I'm not sure what to write next, I think of that advice and I think about the shape of the story, right? I don't want to have a which way is up story. I don't want to spend my time kind of having these incidents where we don't know if things are good or bad. not like a mystery, right? Or where we have things happen and you're not, the main character is not sure, but the emotional arc of the story, I don't want it to remain flat. And
Mm.
so it kind of helps me to think when I'm writing right now, what shape am I driving towards? Which I think is just another way to view your story.
Yeah. Well, before the show, you mentioned something too that was very important. Paraphrasing, but you were saying that writing a story, because there's different. We've talked about pantsers who write as they go, and the plotters that have the outlines and they know exactly where it's going pretty much, and they adhere to that, and they have a complete story. When you're a pantser, you may not be consciously applying all these different roles. And, if you were to get a master in fine arts, which I do not have, to be clear, but I listen to lots of different art techniques and such. There's a bazillion different, mechanisms that you can, I guess, if you're a plotter, that you could apply to craft your story. Then I guess if you want to call them time proven methods, I guess. But if you're a plotter, you're probably not. I mean, if you're a pantser, you're probably not doing that. So it's nice to pants a story and then go back and apply some of the rules post and say, what did we do?
Mhm.
And then go, oh, we did this one, and these are all, good practices and storytelling. And so you validate what you've done. So I always want to throw that out there, that, and I don't even, to be honest, we're having this episode.
Mhm.
I don't even know that I would personally ever want to try and pull out all the different, the 3 arc and the, save the cat and all the different techniques that you can apply and sit there and try and make a story with, well, we didn't have enough save the cat, or we didn't, have enough of this or that, all the different ingredients. I think it would make the story, in my mind, it's just, I don't think it would come out well.
Yeah. Well,
So it,
what I would call out from this is like a lot of those I think are also describe how the plot should move in terms of events, but the shape of the story is a lot about the emotional arc of the character. And that can be a different slice because you can have very stoic characters where bad things happen, and the character doesn't feel bad about it at all, right?
mm,
That wasn't the case in our last story. We want our characters to have emotions and things like that. But
mm,
it may be a good question as to if you're writing a stoic character, what is it that's bad to them? Because those are the human moments, right? We can
mhm,
have, I'm trying to think of an example where you have like a famous, oh, maybe John Wick is the answer, right? He goes through and he murderlates like, hundreds of people in his movies. But the thing that's actually a bad time for him, like even when he got captured, tortured, right? Cuts off his pinky. Those are not bad emotional moments for him necessarily.
mhm,
When his dog gets shot. So
yeah, yeah,
that's he starts out in the hole.
yeah,
He-
yeah, that's true.
so
All relative.
all relative, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that covers everything we wanted to talk about. So with that, we'll sign off for this episode. And I want to thank you all for listening. Please tell your friends and everybody about our show and like us and do all that good, fun social thing. And we'll talk to you next time. Bye.